Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Fred. Um, I'm Terry. I'm alcoholic. Uh, I love this program. Um, I and I love alcoholics. And and we have to love each other because most of us, when we get here, we're not exactly lovable. So, or as Bill Wilson referred to us, an alcoholic in his cups is an unlovely sort. Okay, let's get this rodeo started. I set my timer. Uh, that should give you hope. But those of you who know me really well, you know that timers don't mean a lot to me. But I will occasionally look at my watch. Uh, but we'll see how it goes. You know, I would like to start out with the first time that I think I got an experience with a power greater than myself. Uh, my wife Audrey and I were living in San Francisco. It was 1968 at the time. We were, well, it was the 60s, and we were living in Mill Valley, and I was working in the Haight-Ashbury, if you called it working. And Audrey was very pregnant with our daughter, soon to be daughter. And she went into labor one morning, early morning in September, and we piled into a 57 Ford station wagon with a zigzag man silk screened on the door panels. And we headed into San Francisco because her prenatal care was being provided by the University of California Medical Hospital, which is called Moffitt Hospital, and it's actually right above the Haight-Ashbury. So we were headed there, and we got mid-span of the Golden Gate Bridge, right in the middle of the, and my wife gave birth to our daughter. I was kneeling in the wheel well, and she was lying on the seat, and a friend of mine was driving. And I took our daughter as she came out, and I wrapped her in my shirt, and I gave her to her mother. And I looked up, and I knew we were mid-span because if you've ever gone across the bridge any number of times, you know that you go uphill, and then you level out, and that means you're in the middle of the bridge, and then you go downhill to the other side. And we were right in the middle of the bridge. It was 9:30 in the morning. The fog had broken. It was a beautiful day in the Bay Area in 1968. And I heard this voice in my head. It said, "Pay attention. This is important." And I like to think of that as my cathedral moment that Bill Wilson talks about in his story. And he starts out on the first page of his story, talks about what is. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. And then later on page 10, when his friend, what was his name? Somebody will tell me. Abby. Yes, thank you, Bob. Bob's my sponsor. Uh, and he could actually speak, he could do this whole talk for me, actually. Of course, his jokes wouldn't be as funny, but he would get the story right. Abby, he was talking to Abby in that first time, and he was coming face to face with some ideas that he had very close mind about. It had to do with God and a higher power. But his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen, his fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died, these recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. The wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back again. So he remembered. He remembered when he had been deeply moved. And after my daughter was born on the Golden Gate Bridge, I named her Golden, by the way. I just talked to her on the phone the other day. She's a wonderful woman. She's a school teacher in North Carolina. At any rate, and I went on and I drank and used drugs for another, I don't know, for at least 10 plus years after that. My journey was difficult, you know, at times, and other times, you know, life was not that difficult. I partied a lot, had a good time. I was a musician, so, you know, if you're a musician, I don't know if you know this, but people cut you a break a lot of time because they think you're talented. But in fact, you know, you're no different than anybody else, of course. And about the time I did finally get to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was pretty worn out. I'd put on some pretty hard miles. I'd been divorced by then. You know, I had always been on the run. I was raised in a military family by a couple of hard drinking parents. My mother was, in fact, an alcoholic. My dad was just a hard drinker, I think. And but we traveled all over the world. I lived and gone to school in foreign countries, and then Texas, which is almost a foreign country, I think sometimes. And I'd had an interesting life up to then, and I had dove into the '60s and the counterculture movement head first, and sucked it dry of anything that it had to offer. At any rate, but I had run out of moves, and I was contemplating ending my life. You know, as one of the options that was on the table. I was thinking about a lot of things, and this guy that I had worked for a few years before, who was he'd owned a tavern in Bellingham called the Fairhaven Tavern. Later became the Fairhaven Restaurant, but that time it was called Fairhaven Tavern. And he'd been forced in the early '70s to fire me because I just drank too much on the job. And anyway, this man's name was Chris E. And in the intervening years, and this was 1981, in the intervening years, he had gotten sober. He had a couple of years of sobriety, and he'd gone to AA, and his life had started to change. And he came to see me. I was working at the community college at the time, and he came to see me about something that had to do with my work. But he also stayed to talk to me about his experience. And he would call me up every now and then to check on me and see if I wanted to go to an AA meeting. And I was just not interested, really. And then one day, I was having a particularly bad morning. Well, I'll tell you what had happened. My ex-wife had told me, because I had a period of, a really long period of not drinking, being dry. And she'd confronted me and said that even though I wasn't drinking, I was still an asshole. She might have used the word son of a bitch, but either way, she had a rather succinct way of describing me. And she knew me rather well. And for some reason, it had an effect on me. It just so happened that that day, that guy called one more time, invited me to an AA meeting at noon that day. And so I agreed to go with him. And I went to that meeting, and I have stayed in Alcoholics Anonymous ever since. That was somewhere around the middle of April in 1981. I was still smoking pot at the time, even though I wasn't drinking. And he took me around to all the AA meetings in Bellingham and introduced me to all. It was a relatively small community at that time. He introduced me to all the peeps. And he took me to meet a woman by the name of Claudette, who was kind of the Mother Superior of Alcoholics Anonymous in Bellingham. And she took one look at me and she said, if you're still smoking pot, you're stupid. And that had a profound effect on me. Now, I'd been called stupid before, but never in this context. But I got it. I understood what she meant. And I never, ever smoked pot again after that. And that was the beginning of my sobriety. A couple weeks later, I was lying in bed, and I had a big book. And I picked it up, and I looked at it. The fog had cleared by then. That mushiness that your brain gets when you smoke pot all the time. And or when you drink all the time. Either way, it doesn't matter. Your brain gets mushy. You don't think very clearly. And I picked up the big book, and I read Bill's story. I read it from beginning to end. And as I started out reading it, I was saying, oh, God, this guy's he's a stockbroker, and he's a Republican, too, on top of everything else. And he hated Roosevelt. And I had read that somewhere. And so I said, I don't really like this guy. But by the time I got 3/4 of the way through the story, I said, this guy's like me. Something inside him was very much like me. That pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. And, on page 8, he wrote, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. And I got it. I got that. When I read that, I said, yeah. I identified the first brick in my foundation, identification. And by the time I got to the end of the story, I had tears running down my face. And I got out of bed and I got on my knees and I asked God to help me. And it just surprised me because, I was an existential guy. I believed there was nothing out there. And suddenly, I really hoped that there was something out there. And so, my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous began. And, I started going to meetings. This guy that had 12-stepped me, took me to my first 10 meetings. He became my first sponsor. He took me through the steps. Now, I'm not going to claim that I had an amazing spiritual awakening. But you know what? I really felt like when I was done with my 5th step that I belonged in Alcoholics Anonymous. I had my ticket. I had my membership card. And so I think I had done a good enough job to keep my membership in AA. And then he moved away, and I got another sponsor. And this guy was an old-timer. And at that time, in Bellingham. This guy had 20 years, and I only knew of two other people. I think it was just two other people in Whatcom County that had that much time. And he was wisdom beyond, he had wisdom beyond imagining. He helped me do my amends step. My dad had his larynx removed, had an operation. My mother called me about it, told me I needed to come see him. And so I called my sponsor and I said, you know, my dad's sick and I haven't made my amends to him. You know, I don't want him to die without, you know, giving him a chance to forgive me. Of course, it was all about me. And he said, well, go talk to him, go see him. And I said, well, you know, he and I fight all the time. I had been an anti-war agitator and I'd been involved in all kinds of, you know, stuff. And he had been a career man in the Navy, an officer. And in fact, military intelligence had visited him once and told him that he couldn't talk to me. So he didn't talk to me for 3 years. He'd meet me in the hallway and he'd say, I have nothing to say to you. I can't talk to you. I mean, that's the kind of relationship we had. And then when we did talk, we would fight about the war in Vietnam. We would fight about everything, politics. I was a resentful little guy. And so I told this to my sponsor, and I said I didn't know what to do. And he said, do you think you can spend half an hour in his company and not get in a fight with him? I said, well, yeah, I think I could. So why don't you just drive over to Oak Harbor and see him and just stay for a half an hour. And then at the end of a half hour, just excuse yourself and say you have somewhere to go and go home. And don't get in a fight with him. So I gave it a try. And that half hour over the next year or two stretched out till I could spend all afternoon at home with my parents and with my father. And I could have the beginnings of a relationship with him that I had never had, that hadn't involved, you know, shouting and blaming and resentment. A great gift. A great gift. I also needed to make amends to my ex-wife, Audrey. She had been through a lot. And we had a couple of kids together, and we were trying to raise them together, and there was a lot of shit in the way I had to deal with. So I called her up. Actually, we were talking about something else. I think we were talking about money, and it just kind of came out. And I said, well, I need to make amends to you. And her response was, I'm not going to let you make amends to me. I mean, she was pissed. And so I said, okay. She calls me up a couple of days later, and she says, I've thought about it, and I will, you can make amends to me, but I have some conditions. One is that we have to meet on a neutral site, and two, I want to have my Al-Anon sponsor there with me. Well, that kind of knocked me back a bit. So I called my sponsor, Wes, and I told him this. And I said, well, that just seems a bit much. And he said, oh, who is this Al-Anon sponsor? And I told him, and he said, oh, I know her. She's a really nice lady. I'll tell you what, I'll go with you. So I did my 9th step, amends with my ex-wife, in the company of her Al-Anon sponsor and my AA sponsor. And it was, you know, it didn't make it any easier, I'll tell you. But I got to the end of it and I said, well, is there anything I left out? Anything you want to tell me? She reached in her purse and she pulled out a sheet of paper. It was written on both sides. The learning began. And by the end of that session, I knew a bit more about how I had affected her than I did when I went there. And my education, I really believe, began on that day. You know, in the year 2000, she passed away. She had a heart problem. She passed away. And when and we were the night before, the night that she passed away, the next day we had planned on getting together with our kids on Thanksgiving Day and having dinner together. We never were able to get back together again, but we were able to be civil to each other and, to help raise our kids. And that was a great gift. And when they had the memorial for her, she was really well known in Bellingham. In fact, we both were. A relatively small town. And my kids asked me if I would speak at her memorial service. And I think it's another great gift of this program. Families can be healed. Maybe not always put together again, but a lot of healing can happen. These steps are just amazing that way. And, when I tried my hand at sponsoring in those early years, I would sponsor a guy and, either he would never call me a second time or he would disappear or I'd have these interesting experiences, which I won't go into. But it just didn't work out. And, I think I was a couple years sober and I get there's this woman that I went to in my home group, which was the Southside group of Bellingham. She worked with women a lot, and a lot of single women, a lot of women who had a rough time in their life. Her name was Annie Mix. Actually, she's still alive. She lives over in Moses Lake. A great woman. She called me and said, "Terry, I understand you have a pickup truck." And I said, "Well, yeah, I do." She said, "I got one of my gals is moving this weekend. Be there." And she gave me the address and the time, and she said, "There'll be pizza." So that started a relationship that lasted a couple of years until I sold the truck. And so, once a month, often, maybe more times, I'd be there with my truck helping somebody move in AA. Became a thing. And none of the guys that I tried to sponsor in those years ever stayed sober. But I want you to know, every one of those women I helped move stayed moved. It was it was a good deal. And I got introduced to service. I got introduced to that, how to be useful, how to be of service. But I still had some problems inside me. And I went to therapy a few times, but nothing could get around a great, overwhelming truth that it took me a while to understand what it was. And the book is very specific about it. The program's very, very specific about it. It talks about it in the 60s, which is what we used to call page 60 through, 61, 62, 63. It says that selfishness and self-centered, we believe, is the root of all of our problems. And I believe that is my major character defect. It's not that I thought so highly about myself. It's not that I thought so badly about myself. It's just that I thought only about myself. And that affected all my relationships. I've been married and divorced often enough that I had to start numbering them. It has not been an easy road for me because of my selfishness. And I did not know that that was my problem. I thought I had a bad picker. And it turns out all of the women that I've had anything to do with in my life are wonderful people. Wonderful people. And they had their problems, some more than others. But the real problem lied within. It's inside me. There was a part of me that I had trouble accessing. It says And we agnostics, that deep down inside every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God, or good, as I like to say sometimes. But we have it blocked by calamity, pomp, and the worship of other things. And calamity comes and it goes. Pomp, that's ego. That is, look at me. That's that place in society. And worship of other things is my love of stuff. The need for more, always. And that had me blocked from that part of me that was good. And I believe that the steps are designed to help me unlock that and to clear away those things that have me blocked. And then the third step is very clear. Says a lot of stuff in the third step it's worth talking about. But the thing that I think is the most important, or at least my interpretation, is that relieve me of the bondage of self, so that I may do thy will. And I think I kept expecting somehow that there would be a vital spiritual experience would come down and elevate me, and my life would suddenly get better, and wonderful things would happen. Well, some good things did happen, don't get me wrong. I had an interesting life. But there came a point when I had to start understanding I had to do more. I had to do more. And my last long-term relationship, we never actually got married, although my last sponsor, Dean, told me that. He said that you have to count her as being married. And I said, why? It's because you lived with her for 10 years, for God's sakes. Old Dean was, he was a tough guy. Anyway, after she and I split up, I had a choice I had to make. Was I going to cut and run as I always had when things didn't work out the way I wanted them to? What was I going to do in this? Or was I going to try to maintain some kind of semblance of relationship with this person? Now, she had moved on with another guy. This guy was the fiddler in our band. He was the fiddle player in our band. Fine guy. His name was Daniel. And so she went off with him, and because for whatever reason. And I had to decide what I wanted to do. And they were willing to continue to play music together. They were up for it. And we would stay a band, and I agreed to do that. And so I saw them every week for rehearsals or whenever we played someplace. And I made an effort to remain friends and to try to be a good person in that relationship. And not hold her responsible, not be angry at her for her finding another guy. Or at him for stealing my girlfriend away. How was I going to deal with this? I was sober in this program for 23 years at the time. So I thought maybe it's time I grew up and did this differently. So I tried it, and things went along okay. And I don't have any complaints how things went. But when he had brain cancer, as it turns out, and over a period of a few years, he got successively worse, and he reached a point where she could no longer take care of him by herself. She didn't drive, so I became their driver and helped out as whatever ways I could. And I became part of, the group of people that accompanied him to the end of his life. And when he passed away, the family asked me if I wanted to be there. They invited me to be there, and they said, we want you to have you there. And so I was there when they unplugged the ventilator. And I know it's tough stuff, but and I have to tell you, the guy that did that was part of that, he wasn't He wasn't me. That wasn't me. I don't know who that guy was. I have no idea. But I do know that I was a changed person after that. I had had trouble with anger and rage on and off. My mother had been a rageaholic, and I had trouble with anger and rage on and off all my life. And after that experience, it was like a 2 or 3 year experience. And then after that, of course after that, she started to lose her sight and became legally blind. And so I ended up by helping her and driving her everywhere and doing some things with her and helping her out. And that was not me. That was not me. That was not the old me. But it was the me that I read about in the big book, that was promised to me in the big book. Now, it was a person that I could become. I could be of maximum use to God and to others. Love and tolerance would become my code. And I began to have those experiences. And that cathedral moment I had years ago, when God spoke to me and said, pay attention, I now understood what it meant. I could really see the people around me. I could see who they were. I could see their pain. I could see things about them that I had been blocked before, that I never understood. I had misinterpreted everything. I made shit up. I was good at that. I was good at talking to you and making up what you were thinking. I was a mind reader. Anyway, so my life started to change even more. And, one day my ex had called me and said that she was having financial trouble, and I ended up by paying for her storage, because she was basically homeless at the time. Everything's fine in her life now. She finally, things settled down, but at that time, she was still, and so I had paid, and it was a pretty good sum of money. It was more than I really could afford, and I was afraid to tell my sponsor Dean, because he thought he wasn't sure what I was doing. And so I told him what I had done, and he looked at me and he said, Terry, I wouldn't do that. He said, but you must be getting something out of it. And it turns out I was. Here's something I've come to believe. I come to believe that we have different motivations. Reasons why we do things. We have good ones and bad ones. Bill talks about this in the 12 by 12. He says we're very good at hiding a bad motive under a good motive. And so I get that. I understood that. And so I looked really closely at what I was doing there. And I looked at what the bad motive would have been, that I wanted to have her back, or I wanted her to love me, And that was the bad motive. And what was the good motive? The good motive was she was a person who needed someone to help her. She was struggling. She was one of God's children. She needed help. So, I looked at that and I said, what does God want me to do here? What should I be doing? And it turns out that what I should be doing is that I should be asking God to relieve me of my bad motives and to reinforce and to concentrate on the good motives. And so I started doing that. I started praying about it. And what happened for me is the bad motives evaporated very quickly. It took a while, but very quickly those bad motives went away. And when I saw them in the light, I saw what I was doing, and I saw what I needed to do. And I think what Dean was trying to tell me is I needed to look at my motives. I need to examine them, not gloss them over, not hide them. So I've tried to do that, and when I'm sponsoring people, I try to point that out to them. What's your motive here? What are your motives? If you got mixed motives, pray about the good motive. Concentrate on that good motive and see what happens. Um, you know, in April, I will be celebrating 40 years of sobriety. And this last year, since my sponsor Dean died, I've had a lot of chance to think about that. You know, I ended up by being one of his drivers. My friend Bob was a driver too, but he moved to Seattle, so I sort of ended up by being his main driver, taking him to meetings every day and helping him with his stuff and that kind of thing. And because, you know, it needed to be done. Somebody needed to step up and do it. And something interesting happened. And I think I should tell this story because it tells you something about the community of AA that we live in. I was driving around. I had an old car. You know, it was serviceable, but it worked okay. But it finally came to the end. You know, it had just way too many miles on it. And I was fixing it, and I was running out of money trying to fix it. And so I told a couple of people what was going on. And the next thing I know, Bob and my friend David got together a GoFundMe, and they raised over $10,000 to buy me another car so I could keep on driving Dean to meetings. Now, I got myself an Orca pass. I could still continue to get around. I mean, you know, I've ridden the bus before. I'm not helpless. But that's not what God intended for me to do. He wanted me to escort Dean home. You know, Ram Dass says something that I think is very true. It's true for Alcoholics Anonymous. He says that we're all just walking each other home. And, you know, what is this thing all about? What am I here for? What am I supposed to be doing? You know? Well, that's what I'm supposed to help people. You know, I sponsor a lot of people. I got some guys, well, some of them are here in this meeting. And I have found a life that allows me to be profoundly useful. You know, to be able to give back to something that's given me a great life. You know, to walk humbly under the grace of God. To understand the meaning of true ambition. That it was not what I thought it was. You know. And that is, what's the purpose of all this? Well, it's got some other purposes. But one of the purposes is that die sober. Get to the end of your life and be sober. Do not drink. You know. And to find something within yourself that allows you to give to others. And to have that conscious contact with something outside yourself, whatever you want to call it, whether you call it God or whatever you want to call it. You know, to have something outside yourself that lends you strength and tells you you're not alone. And sometimes God is represented by a man that's placed in front of me, or a woman who calls me on the phone because she's having problems, or a family member who needs my counsel. You know, I don't have a lot left in the tank. But what I have, I'm going to try to share as freely as I can. Because what am I going to do? Take it with me? Hey, you know, I've run out of wall space for guitars. I have more than enough. I have more than enough of everything. So anyway, I love all of you. I want to thank Fred again for asking me to do this. This has been, a good experience for me. I hope it's been okay for you guys. I love all of you, and I love the weird ones the most. And the guy that's the weirdest, man, I'm with you every step of the way. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Terry. A great discussion on how to help other people. One thing I was going to ask you, Terry, is you're in the music business, so you were around pot and alcohol quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
How did you do that? I found I could.
Well, I have to say, Fred, that that's a difficult thing, and at first I could not. I have to say that. And I'll tell you what I did. I started just playing in folk venues, where there were families and stuff. And then in the about 1984, I'm going to guess, maybe 85. I can't remember exactly when it was. Anyway, I ran into a guy, and he was not an alcoholic, and he wanted to start a community chorus. People get together and sing. And so we started out just singing in people's living rooms. And it ends up that we helped found a group called the Colshan Chorus in Bellingham. It became a community arts, private nonprofit organization and we would have concerts, like 3 or 4 concerts a year. And we sang a lot of different kinds of music, a lot of gospel music, a lot of rock music, whatever. We had 80 people up on the risers, and we would sing our hearts out. And that group is, of course, it's on hiatus now because of the pandemic, but Dave celebrated something like 30 years of being together. It's still going strong. And I helped start it, and I was able to satisfy that need for music for many years through this, and also my need for service by being involved with that organization. I was president of its board for a long time. And I think you can find whatever it is you need in life. I can, a few years ago, we used to go play in a bar once a week, and I never had a problem with it. It would get a little rough towards the end, people get really drunk, but I was safe and protected because I had a purpose to be there. But early on, it was difficult.